And now let's finish up this podcast with that. What are the impacts? What do I think the prospective, possible impacts of this transition of power in Saudi Arabia going to entail? And again, we're projecting in the future. Don't hold me to this. I've been wrong in the past. I'll be wrong in the future. But I think it's a very important big deal, and I don't think enough has been reported on or chatted about this transition of power in Saudi Arabia, because everybody reported when he died, and everybody's like, oh, King Abdullah died, and next page, tomorrow's a new day, and nobody cares. I think it's worthy of a bit more of attention than that, because King Abdullah's death and this new monarch taking over, King Abdullah's death means that the entire Middle East, not just Saudi Arabia, but the entire Middle East is kind of nearing the end of a really historic, extraordinary, crazy era of leadership. And this is leadership of a whole bunch of dudes, not women, a whole bunch of dudes across a whole bunch of different parts of the Middle East who were in power for a very long time and who focused on stability over all other things. Stability over all other things. Meaning that they quashed extremism as hardcore as they could, but also any political dissent, any sort of movement towards political reform, towards political change, towards a liberal democracy, towards individual human rights. All of these leaders across the Middle East has, as a general rule, for decades said, no, we want stability and we're not interested in that other stuff. Because we want to fight extremism and terrorism, yes, but we're not going to allow any of that other stuff to happen either. And I'll just point out a few of them. Consider the leaders of the Middle East for your whole lifetime and most of mine. King Hussein was the leader of Jordan for 47 years. He died in 1999, and his son took over, King Abdullah II. And I love King Abdullah of Jordan. He's a good guy too. But one ruler for 5 decades, his son took over and will be in charge for 5 decades. Muammar Gaddafi, who was by all definitions insane, ruled Libya for 42 years single-handedly and set the stage for that country to be falling apart, which it now is. Hosni Mubarak, who was the former head of Egypt, he was supposedly elected to power. Not really. It's a one-party state. And he was in power for 30 years. Then they turned into a democracy, and then they overthrew the democracy, and now another military guy's in charge of Egypt. And he'll probably be in charge of Egypt for another 30 years unless something changes. Hafez al-Assad was the president of Syria for almost 30 years until he died, and his son, Bashar al-Assad, has taken over ever since in the year 2000. So you see this lineage of all these folks that have been in power for decades, and then if they ever die, then their son takes over. Or in the case of Saudi Arabia, their brother takes over. Oh, we haven't even pointed out another crazy one. Muammar Gaddafi helped destroy Libya for 4 decades. Saddam Hussein was in power for almost 25 years, helping to destroy Iraq. And what all these folks did, in greater or lesser extent, was quash extremism, quash political expression. And again, I hate to say this because I like King Abdullah. I like King Abdullah II. I like King Abdullah. I like King Hassan of Morocco. But, these are folks that are not interested in radical overhauls of the political system, and so they kind of push that stuff off to the side. Stability at all costs. And when you start to add up all of these leaders and their time in office, that generation of leaders across the Middle East, you hopefully start to understand maybe why there's latent dissent that's been building up for decades across the entire Middle East and is now bubbling to the surface all across the Middle East. Even though you're just now taking this class here in 2015, you may have heard of this Arab Spring thing that started a couple of years ago. Protests that started in Tunisia, then Egypt, then Yemen, and Jordan, and Libya. I mean, why do you think that is? It's because they've kept the lid on all these Middle Eastern countries so long and have not allowed for political expression that it's kind of turned into a pressure cooker, and that's why things are popping up all over the place, like the Iraq falling apart, like the Syrian civil war, like the rise of ISIS taking over the place. It's like, okay, I'll stop with that for now because we want to just list off a few of the impacts of this transition. So this All these Middle Eastern leaders, of which King Abdullah was a part of, and the new King Salman is also part of, they're older dudes from a bygone era almost that have been in charge of the Middle East, but things are changing fast, and they're old and they're dying off. And some of them are already dead, like Saddam Hussein and Muammar Gaddafi. But what are the impacts I want you to know of this transition of power in Saudi Arabia? We'll talk impacts at home first. Not many. Okay, good times for the Saudi Arabian peeps right now because they're getting money thrown on top of them to promote social stability at home. And as I've already suggested, short term, everybody's going to be happy to get some checks in the mail. Longer term, probably not a whole lot's going to change under King Salman. It's just not going to happen. Not socially, not politically, not anything else. And in fact, there's every indication that the conservative clerical class will have more influence over King Salman than they did over King Abdullah. So again, if Saudi society takes a step backwards, it's going to be a small step backwards, not a huge, but we certainly are not predicting a step forward, not for any sort of liberal reform. Let's finish up with impacts abroad. What are the impacts of a more conservative regime in Saudi Arabia that may be more influenced by conservative Wahhabist Islamic thought? And Wahhabism is I think it's also called Salafism. Wahhabism, Wahhabism. Wahhabism or Wahhabist is a fairly ultra-orthodox take on Islam. Very traditional. Very conservative. These would be the folks that would say, no, if someone were to say, hey, we think women should be allowed to drive, Wahhabists would be like, no, not ever. In fact, women should probably be at home and not be out in public and should only be able to go out in public with a husband or father. I mean, fairly ultra-conservative ideology. That's the Wahhabist. I feel like they have more influence on the new king than they did the old one. Okay? The old one had to pay attention to them too, but then again, this new king, not as self-confident, not as assertive, not as a big persona as King Abdullah, will be more swayed by ultra-conservative Wahhabist ideology. It's my instinct. It could be wrong. So how's that going to affect Saudi Arabia abroad? I actually think it's going to make Saudi Arabia expand its regional power. And perhaps in a very hawkish way. Saudi Arabia, even under King Abdullah, had been buying billions and billions of dollars of weaponry. There's all sorts of regional rivalries happening in the Middle East, a couple of which I'll get to in a second. And the Sauds have had the money, the organization, and the willpower under King Abdullah to step up and start to assume more of a leadership role. That has not been the case for most of Saudi history. Okay, they're a powerful entity, a powerful ethnicity in the center of Islam, and all that stuff, but they have not really pushed their power abroad. I think that's getting ready to start happening. Okay, you're going to see Saudi Arabia take a much more muscular approach, which they have actually started since the Arab Spring, whenever those revolutions kind of started and street protests started. The Sauds were never under any great threat because, first off, they throw money at all their citizens, but secondly, they kind of quash any sort of local political dissent. And the Sauds, for most of their foreign policy, and I keep saying the Sauds are in charge of Saudi Arabia, but the Sauds are a political dynasty. Again, it's a monarchy, so the Sauds are this family that rules Saudi Arabia. So the Sauds, for most of their history, have pushed their political agenda abroad with money, not with force. Meaning they got tons of money because of oil, and so they would fund political people they liked in other countries, and they may funnel money to this group over here who's fighting this other group they don't like. So it's more soft power based on money. I think you're going to see that change. And right this second, the Sauds hate Bashar al-Assad, the president of Syria. They've wanted him out of power for years, and they have been funding people to throw him out of power for years. And now they've started to turn that into hard power. Like I told you in the last podcast, hard power means that they sent jets to go bomb President al-Assad of Syria in conjunction with U.S. attacks on ISIS. So You see how it's turning from soft influence with money to harder influence with military. You're going to see that expand. I think you're going to see it expand slowly under Salman and perhaps more under a potential King Mohammed. Remember that guy I talked about 20 minutes ago. So a more muscular approach is certainly going to prevail. I shouldn't say certainly. I'm predicting the Sauds are going to start expanding their military muscle across the region, probably against ISIS, probably against Syria, the Syrian leadership, and maybe against Iran, the other major regional rival that the Sauds don't like, and the Iranians don't like them right back. So you have all sorts of entities that the new administration is going to push hard against. All of these are perceived, real or perceived enemies of the kingdom. By the way, every time I say the kingdom, that's Saudi Arabia. So they're going to push hard against all the perceived or real enemies of the kingdom in a much more hawkish way, probably using more military prowess because they've spent 10, 20, 50 billion dollars buying mostly U.S. military hardware in the last decade. The fight that they're going to be much more open about, I'm predicting in the future, is the fight against Al-Qaeda. Remember, I told you Al-Qaeda originally was formed to overthrow the House of Saud. So they're going to start going after Al-Qaeda more, and they have. And there's a growing presence of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula down there in Yemen, which has been growing in power, and the Sauds ain't happy about that, and they're probably going to start blowing people up down there. You're going to see that the Sauds start fighting ISIS more, although they're hesitant, because ISIS is also fighting against the Syrian regime, and so the Sauds are sitting there going, okay, well, the ISIS people are kind of way too conservative and crazy, but they're fighting our enemies. And so ISIS has been fighting against Bashar al-Assad of Syria. ISIS wants to overthrow him, and Saudi Arabia is in favor of that. ISIS wants to perhaps fight against Shia-influenced, Iranian-influenced Iraq, and Saudi Arabia is okay with that. ISIS wants to fight against Hezbollah, a Iranian-funded terrorist group, and Saudi Arabia is okay with that. ISIS wants to probably even fight against Iran itself, and Saudi Arabia is okay with that. But ISIS also wants to overthrow the House of Saud. Oh, I knew there was a catch. So Saudi Arabia is sitting there going, okay, we might actually have to take up the fight against ISIS with the United States or others if anybody else gets involved. And in fact, what's been slowly materializing in the last 6 months, covertly, which is why you haven't heard about it, is that Saudi Arabia has started to take a leadership role trying to rally other Arab states to take up the fight against ISIS. Because ISIS may be doing a lot of things that Team Arab wants, but one of the things that ISIS wants is to kill all the leadership of Team Arab. So they can't have that. So you're liable... Summary, Saudi Arabia probably going to start fighting harder against Al-Qaeda, which they have been, but they're going to take the fight abroad into countries like Yemen. They're going to start having to take the fight to ISIS in Iraq and Syria. They're probably going to quash political dissent more because they feel that all political dissent within Saudi Arabia is funded by Iran. Now, this is a whole other podcast, and I'm not trying to confuse you by throwing tons of stuff at you, but Saudi Arabia and Iran hate each other. They also just happen to be two different sects of Islam. So there's Sunni Islam, okay, and that's what Saudi Arabia is, and there's Shia Islam, and that's what Iran is. So anytime people, and Saudi Arabia is overwhelmingly Sunni, but it does have some Shias there. And anytime that Shias protesters say, hey, we want equal rights, or we feel like we're being discriminated against, the Saudi Arabian government smashes it, and they're like, Iran is funding this. And Iran is funding all Shia groups all across the Middle East to rise up and overthrow their governments. Iran is evil, and Iran's behind all of this. So anytime you see Shia protest, and they've been happening all over the place, including Yemen, the Saudi Arabian government interprets that as that's Iran. It's covert influence of Iran, and we need to attack that and crush it wherever it's happening. And you're going to see them do more of that because they don't like Iran, and they're also going to start fighting against what they see as Iran's proxies all over the region. Again, this is maybe super confusing to you if you don't know Middle East politics, but the leader of Syria that I've referenced several times now, Bashar al-Assad, he is aligned with the Iranians. he's kind of Shia, and that's why Saudi Arabia hates him and wants him to go away. Hezbollah is aligned with Iran, and that's why Saudi Arabia doesn't like them. There's a group in Yemen right now, the Houthi movement, which has taken over Yemen. They're Shia, and so they might be aligned with Iran. And Saudi Arabia doesn't like them either. So what you're going to see is, because Saudi Arabia hates Iran, it hates all the proxies of Iran, and it sees any Shia Islamic stuff, any protest of Shia Islamic folks anywhere in the Middle East as a proxy of Iran, and therefore to be fought against. And again, you heard it here first. If Prince Mohammed becomes King Mohammed, he is openly saying, I'll quash all that stuff. You can forget about it. I'll put the kibosh on any domestic protest, and certainly will help quash any protest we see across the Middle East that we feel is Iranian-backed. You heard it here first. That Prince Mohammed won't play. Now, I'm sorry, this has already gone long again, but I think it's a good podcast. You tell me. The reason I keep bringing up this Prince Mohammed guy, he's not king, and he's second in command, and so it might be decades before he becomes king. So this feels like a test question too, by the way. Why would I keep talking about a guy who may actually never even become king? It's because King Salman put him in second in line. It's the mere fact that he put this guy up to be number 2 to the throne. That's the political statement I want you to understand. They know the attitude of Prince Mohammed. They know what he's all about. They know he's an assertive leader. And they're saying he's going to be number 2. All right? King Salman may never end up doing anything. But the tone, they're setting the precedent that that's where we're going, is Prince Mohammed. That's the future of Saudi Arabia. And if that's what they're doing openly, then of course behind the scenes, they're going to be doing a lot more of that. They're going to move towards a more hawkish, aggressive stance towards all of these things we've talked about. Does that all make sense? So it's a lot to consume in a half an hour, I know. But the last things I'd say, the big worries for Saudi Arabia right this second, ISIS is a worry, yes. Iran is a worry, yes. Iran proxies a worry, yes. Where this is manifesting itself in an explosive way right now, that's probably going to be the number one foreign policy concern for the Sauds right this second, is Yemen. So I've referenced this a couple times. Yemen is currently disintegrating. So it's January 2015. If Yemen is not in full-on civil war by February, by the end of February, I'll be surprised. Yemen is disintegrating. It was 2 countries that were slammed into one. It's probably going to devolve back into 2 countries. There's this Shia group named the Houthis, who pretty much just forced the government of Yemen to abdicate, to quit. And so the whole country's in kind of a bit of chaos. And again, the Saudis are looking at this on their southern border and saying, this is number 1 bad thing. Number 1 bad thing for us is Yemen disintegrating, because we don't trust the Houthi guys down there. They're backed by the Iranians, and we don't like Iranians. So they're making a play to take over Yemen. So the Sauds are going to fight against that. More importantly, to bring this group back into it, Al-Qaeda has a huge presence in Yemen. And in a country that's falling into chaos and civil war, Al-Qaeda is going to gain more ground. And it's on the southern border of Saudi Arabia. So they're very worried about the situation in Yemen right now, and they are likely to do something fairly hawkish, which means they might send in a military. Yeah, I think at a minimum you're going to see Saudi Arabia this year have bombing campaigns across the border to bomb Al-Qaeda and maybe even Houthi-held territories. And that's going to be in concert with U.S. drones going over there to bomb the Al-Qaeda folks. The U.S. doesn't have any huge problem with the Houthis, but you see where I'm going with this. So Yemen is a big issue. The other big issue for the Sauds right this second is that the United States is actually becoming, I won't say friends, the United States' relationship with Iran is getting better. And you might think, well, what's wrong with that? The U.S. and Iran have hated each other since 1979. Don't even have diplomatic relations. The U.S.'s biggest ally in the region is Saudi Arabia. Their best friend is Saudi Arabia. They hate Iran. They love Saudi Arabia. That's the U.S. government. But in the last several years, the Obama administration has made an effort to reach out to Iran, to say, hey, we should reestablish relations. Hey, let's meet to talk about your nuclear program to make sure it's cool. We just don't want you making bombs. Saudi Arabia has been livid about this. So even though Saudi Arabia is best friends with the United States, they're not happy with the United States cozying up to Iran in any way, shape, or form. And this may actually start to cause a bit of a rift between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia. And again, I don't know which direction King Salman's going to take the country, but it doesn't matter. King Abdullah wasn't happy about the warming U.S. ties between the U.S. and Iran. Saudi Arabia considers Iran primary enemy number one over there. Number one enemy for the Sauds, Iran. So they're not happy about the developments between the U.S. and Iran, and King Salman will have to continue to express his unhappiness about this, and it may over time start to push the U.S. and the Sauds a little further away from each other. Again, we're just talking, we're speculating here. The bigger worry I have, and I swear I'm finishing on this right now, the biggest worry I have is actually a dude who's getting ready, who was sentenced to death in Saudi Arabia. What is Boyer talking about? A dude being sentenced to death is Boyer's biggest worry? Yes. Here's the deal. A few months ago, a Shia cleric in Saudi Arabia was sentenced to death by crucifixion. Yeah, I'm not even making this up! Which I think involves like cutting off his head and then putting his body on public display on a cross, I guess. I don't know. It hasn't happened yet. But the Saudi government, and does all this start to make sense now from what I've said for 38 minutes? The Saudi government, whenever it sees Shia protest or Shia uprising or Shias demanding equal rights or anything within their country, they see the hand of Iran. And they don't like it and they quash it. So this Shia cleric, and I'm not going to give you his name, it doesn't matter, it's not important for the story. This Shia cleric, who most people say is just a guy protesting for equal rights for Shias, was arrested, was charged basically with conspiracy to overthrow the House of Saud and overthrow the government, and has been sentenced to death. Now, why would that be the thing that worries old Boyer the most? And I am old. Because he's a Shia in a tense time in the Middle East where you have all of these conflicts I've now referenced in Yemen, in Iraq's falling apart, Syrian civil war, the rise of ISIS. We even got to Israel and Palestine, all that stuff. But all of these issues are starting to take on a tinge of sectarian violence, meaning all the alliances and all the people fighting right now, Sunnis are on one side and Shias are on the other. And that's not historically been the case. And so what's worrisome about this, and why I'm worried about a much more conservative King Salman regime that may be listening more to Wahhabist ultra-conservative clerics and taking their cues from them on what they do, my great fear is that if they kill this guy, if they, in a show of political willpower, are going to cut off the head of a Shia guy in their country, it's going to set off a firestorm of sectarian violence and essentially a sectarian war across the greater Middle East. Because, you know, they don't have enough wars going on yet. So let's add this other dimension. Now, again, I'm speculating here. I'm hoping that they will just put the guy in jail and not kill him. But it's the critical thing to watch. Because if King Salman's administration says, well, no, he's already been sentenced to death and we are going to carry it out no matter what, again, much like anointing Prince Mohammed as the second in command, if they execute the Shia cleric, they are suggesting, they're telling you, here's the direction we're going in. Here, we're going this way, and you better step back because it's going to get messy. That's why it's my greatest fear. If they go this direction, it's going to get messy. So, full summary here, shift in power, no great shift in policy, but underneath, we could be seeing Saudi Arabia become much more aggressive and muscular in military power and the use of its military power. And you could also be seeing a move conservatively backwards a half step, which won't affect too much at home in Saudi Arabia, but I believe might start to fuel further sectarian division across the greater Middle East, in which a more muscular, assertive Saudi Arabia will light the powder keg even hotter. That makes sense? So nothing against the guy, nothing against the new king. We're just trying to figure out what are the implications of this power shift. And this is just some food for thought I've given you. Hope that helps. It's a complicated, long one, but if you have any other questions or want me to expand upon particular parts of this, hit me up and we'll do yet another podcast on what's going on in the Middle East or other parts of the planet. But for now, party on, King Salman style.